So we're continuing on with track one. This is ocean-based contributions to global decarbonization. Dr. Cyranak's going to be talking about protecting blue carbon ecosystems to avoid future greenhouse gas emissions. Dr. Cyranak runs the Coastal Carbon Laboratory at the Institute for Coastal Plain Science at Georgia Southern University. Research in his lab focuses on the carbon cycle in coastal ecosystems such as estuaries, marshes, coral reefs, mangroves, and seagrass beds. Dr. Cyranak's lab is interested in the role that these ecosystems play in the global carbon cycle, how they'll be affected by climate change, and what role they can play in carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere.
All right, thanks, Sarah. So today I'm going to talk to you about blue carbon ecosystems and what we can do to sort of protect them so we can avoid releasing more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So I am at Georgia Southern University, which is right down the road here in Savannah and Statesboro, Georgia, so not too far away in coastal Georgia. And I really am a carbon biogeochemist. Okay, so this is our planet. This is a famous photograph called Blue Marble. It was taken in 1972. And since then, there's been a lot of changes to our planet, although you probably wouldn't notice them from this far out. But I want to sort of start with thinking about the carbon cycle. And I like to use this Carl Sagan quote that I've added something to the end there, which is, "We are all star stuff." So he's very famous for this quote, just talking about how all of the elements that are in us came from the furnaces of stars. But we are all star stuff recycled. And if we think about carbon, what we mean about that is the carbon's sort of been around. So I want everyone in here to sort of close their eyes, take a deep breath, and think about where all the carbon dioxide you're breathing in has come from. So we're in an enclosed room, a lot less people than we were in earlier. There's still some extra carbon dioxide floating around, people from overseas, people from California. So carbon dioxide, just from around the area, has traveled in a way. And then you can think about really where that carbon dioxide has come from metabolism. So what you've eaten. So maybe some avocados from Mexico, some jamon from Spain, or some lamb from New Zealand. That carbon dioxide or carbon has made it into you, and then you're exhaling it into the atmosphere here. So that is sort of the carbon cycle on the small scale here, but on a global scale, you can think of where that carbon has been over long time scales. Maybe a little bit of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere has been to the deep ocean. Some of it's been in fossil fuels that was locked away for millions, hundreds of millions of years, and now is being released. So the oceans play a really large role in Earth's carbon cycle. You can see here, this is sort of diagram showing the amount of carbon, so the inventory of carbon in the oceans compared to the atmosphere. So the ocean is this big, this big blue circle here, so 38,000 gigatons or so. This little circle up here is the atmosphere. We're talking about 800-ish gigatons. And then down here we have soils and land biomass. And so this is really what's known as the active carbon cycle, where carbon's being exchanged on shorter time scales on the scale of maybe days to years to centuries. So in this sort of fast carbon cycle, seawater holds about 44 times the amount of carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere. It's 93% of all the inorganic carbon in what we would call the fast. The slow carbon cycle is sort of the carbon that's locked away in rocks, and that just is called slow because it takes tens to hundreds of thousand years to cycle. And the oceans have also already absorbed about 25% of the human CO2 emissions to the atmosphere to date. So the oceans play a very, very critical role. So gigaton, petagram, megaton. So this is a quote from Ken Caldera, who's a climate scientist, that I was watching one of his talks. If you multiply anything by a gigantic number, you end up with even more gigantic numbers. So what does gigaton, petagram, all this even mean? How can we think about that in terms of the actual amount of carbon that's moving around the Earth? And so I'm going to show you one thing I actually put on one of my biogeochemistry exams for my master's students, which is I ask them how many Mount Everest worth of carbon are dissolved in the oceans. First thing you got to do is figure out how much Mount Everest weighs, which luckily there's a website called The Weight of Stuff. Now, if you're feigning credibility for this website, you don't believe it, it actually does a pretty good job of describing where they actually derive the weight of it from. But how many Mount Everest do you think are dissolved in the ocean? Turns out, if you do this calculation, there's about 235 Mount Everest worth of inorganic carbon. So maybe that puts this petagram, gigaton type thing into scale a little bit. What about blue carbon ecosystems? Where are they and what are they? Because they're playing a role in this global carbon cycle and they're playing a role in the oceanic carbon cycle. They're really at the interface between land and sea. And what you can see here are mangrove forests, tidal marshes, and seagrass ecosystems and their distributions around the globe. Mangroves tend to be in the more tropics, tidal marshes sort of in the subtropics, and then seagrasses are a little more globally ranging. But if you look at this compared to, well, in this image, the vast whiteness of the ocean here, coastal blue carbon ecosystems occupy only 0.5% of the seafloor. So they don't actually take up much of the aerial extent of the oceans or even benthic ecosystems in the oceans. But they contribute to greater than 50% of the oceanic organic carbon burial on a yearly basis. So they're very, very important ecosystems in the global carbon cycle. This is a paper that looked at fluxes of carbon between different systems and compared coastal blue carbon systems to terrestrial systems. And you can see their orders of magnitude more carbon being fluxed in and out of these systems on a yearly basis. So what are these three main blue carbon ecosystems? So we'll go through each one here. We have mangroves. These are salt-tolerant trees that grow mainly between 30 degrees north and south. They're really in tropical regions. 54 different species of true mangroves, creating these ecosystems where a really diverse abundance of marine and terrestrial life can live, lots of birds, lots of nursery ground for different things like that. And they are sort of really blue carbon ecosystems because of the anoxic sediments where the carbon traps, which is going to become something that is a continuing trend here. Seagrasses, they are the only flowering plant to live in marine environments. They evolved 3 to 4 times from land to sea, so that's kind of interesting. There's 60 species around the globe. They're a little bit more extensive than mangroves because they're subtropical and tropical species. And once again, they provide habitat for a lot of different diverse organisms. And you can see, I put this picture here because you can see the roots, which is really where a lot of the carbon is stored down in the sediments. Once again, usually anoxic sediments, which is important. And then salt marshes make up the third ecosystem. They occur across 99 countries. They're pretty extensive in the subtropical latitudes. And once again, they have muddy anoxic sediments, diverse habitats, habitat for all sorts of organisms. And you can see here in the Spartina marsh here, this just dark black mud where all this carbon is being trapped. So I'm going to talk about one other coastal ecosystem, which are coral reefs. This is not a blue carbon ecosystem. And I'm showing you this because I'm going to introduce some chemistry here, and showing pretty pictures of coral reefs always helps introduce some chemical ideas, but also because I've seen in a couple articles that come out recently that people are talking about coral reefs and capturing carbon dioxide as calcium carbonate as a way to store and capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And really, this does not work. And the reason why is because when corals or other organisms and natural non-biogenic calcification or calcium carbonate precipitation occurs, it changes the chemistry in a way that releases CO2 from the oceans back into the atmosphere. And this is a dephase plot. So this is inorganic carbon down here. This is total alkalinity. And based on these two parameters, and if you know temperature and salinity, you can calculate what the PCO2 is. So the higher PCO2 is this more orangey color down to blue, where we have lower PCO2 levels. And so if we take a starting point and we think about photosynthesis, we're going to move in this direction, where we are moving from higher PCO2s to lower PCO2. And the change in PCO2 between the water and the atmosphere is what causes the exchange. So if it's lower than 400, which is about the average in the atmosphere, it will take CO2 up. If it's higher, it will release CO2. If you do calcification, you sort of come down in this 2-to-1 ratio of taking total alkalinity and dissolved inorganic carbon out of seawater. So you are taking inorganic carbon out of seawater, but you're also removing alkalinity. And so we are crossing these iso lines into these much more higher PCO2 conditions and then enhancing CO2 efflux. So this is why coral reefs are not blue carbon ecosystems, but this chemistry is really important to think about in blue carbon ecosystems, which we'll talk about in a little bit more. So what makes up a blue carbon ecosystem? Really, we can think of the carbon moving or being in the ecosystem in two ways. So the first thing is to think of the carbon stocks, and this is the carbon that nature has already put in the bank. So this is the carbon that is stored in these systems already, and this is what we are thinking of in the idea that we're going to preserve the blue carbon, we're going to preserve the carbon that's already buried there to avoid emissions in the future. And it's always generally stored in the sediments where you've got a lot of anoxic environments that are going to inhibit degradation, oxic degradation of that organic matter and allow it to be stored for long periods of time. So if we look at carbon stocks of these three ecosystems across the globe, there's about 10 to 24 petagrams of a big range, right? And that range is for quite a few reasons. Number one, we have to think about how deep we're going to look at the carbon, but also for some things, especially seagrass, the actual extent of these ecosystems goes into these calculations, and it's hard to know how much seagrass exists around the globe. But about 10 to 24 petagrams of carbon is stored in these systems, and this image here is sort of the range of the stock. The edge of the dark blue to the end of the light blue shows you, and these little things above there show you the range of these estimates. Mangroves by far are storing the most, with seagrass and then salt marshes. If we think about it on the global scale, though, the carbon currently underground in these systems is really 1 to 2.5 years of 2022's global CO2 emissions. So that's a lot of carbon, right, that's stored down there. Let's think about the carbon fluxes, though. This is the exchange of carbon from these systems. In reality, these carbon fluxes are what leads to the carbon stocks being there in the first place. It just takes a long time for the carbon fluxes to capture the CO2. But you can think of these as the deposits and withdrawals of carbon from the blue carbon bank. And here we just have CO2 going in and out. This is eddy correlation of a marsh showing just sort of the yearly seasonal cycle, but also the more high temporal daily, weekly cycles in net primary production and gross primary production of these ecosystems. So this is the exchange, and so we've got to think about this a little bit differently than the carbon that's already stored there. If we look globally, there's about 30 to 70 teragrams, so we're 1 order of magnitude or 3 orders of magnitude lower from a petagram here. Across the globe, and if we do that same calculation, these yearly fluxes only represent about 1 to 2.5 days of 2022's global CO2 emissions. So a big difference, 1 to 2.5 days to 1 to 2.5 years. So what do carbon fluxes and stocks look like on a global scale? So just to give you an idea, this is something I found on Twitter from this Dr. Robert Rhodes. So I put him down in the deep ocean down here because there's a little bit less exchange happening, but you can see how carbon's moving around the Earth. So we've got the deep ocean, the atmosphere, the living biosphere, fossil fuel deposits, which is slowly just draining as we go up year by year. And you can see how much is exchanging between these systems, but also how much is actually in the systems as well. So this can give you an idea of how complex things are on a global scale. But when we start to narrow down to something like a blue carbon ecosystem, we have a lot more processes that are happening over different time scales. And this can make things really complicated for looking at how much carbon is coming and going or how much carbon is being stored by these systems. And so, for instance, you can have carbon burial from carbon that's maybe transported from upland down the river. You have exchanges of carbon in the sediments, in the seagrass themselves. In the water column, you have carbon being cycled. You have export of carbon in and out from the ocean side down here. And you have atmospheric exchange of carbon. You have carbon uptake by the plants themselves and then transport down. So there's really, really lots of complex things happening. You have groundwater inputs and groundwater infiltration that can affect the carbon cycle. And then you have all sorts of different processes, and there will be a quiz on all of these at the end of this talk. But these are the different biogeochemical processes that occur in coastal systems and sediments and water column, et cetera, and the way they affect the carbon and alkalinity balance of the seawater. And this is really controlling whether these systems are going to take up or emit carbon back into the atmosphere. Okay, so this brings about the question, what are some carbon fluxes taking place in these ecosystems? So let's just think about, I'm going to show you two examples of some that you maybe haven't thought about that are not just the canonical blue carbon ecosystems do photosynthesis and they store that carbon for long periods of time. This was a paper from 2018 showing that methane emissions from blue carbon systems, so the transformation of organic carbon into methane, can offset what we account blue carbon burial as. So by about 20%, if we take in the fact that methane is a stronger greenhouse gas over a 20-year period, they can offset what we would call carbon burial, right? Because this methane is going to act as a stronger greenhouse gas over a shorter time period. And we can see here there's about 6.4 teragrams of carbon being emitted from mangroves alone. So this was 2018. There's been a few papers published since then and a lot more than I'm just about to show you, but we also need to look at nitrous oxide emissions on top of methane because that's another even stronger greenhouse gas. And these papers look at how this complicates the climate benefits of teal carbon, which is upstream wetlands, so freshwater wet streams, and blue carbon, which is really the marine version of that. Methane emissions offset the atmospheric carbon dioxide uptake in macroalgae, mixed vegetation, and sediment ecosystems. This is a paper that just came out this year. And then thinking about the spatiotemporal variability of these emissions is really, really critical because it happens on different time scales, and we need to really understand how we can measure those over those different time scales to account for these types of things. Another interesting sort of process, biogeochemical process that we need to think about in blue carbon systems is alkalinity production. And so these coastal ecosystems, alkalinity really in the ocean is coming from land weathering or production in coastal ecosystems in some form or another. And when this carbon is buried in anoxic, no oxygen environments, you get sulfate reduction that occurs. And if those sulfides are bound up by iron, that alkalinity can be released. And so these coastal ecosystems can act as little ocean alkalinity enhancement areas where they're releasing stored carbon that then goes into the ocean to stay as carbonate and bicarbonate ions. But you need to do this step here because if you don't, the sulfides that get released get oxidized when they come in contact with oxygen, and that takes away the alkalinity. So this paper looked at this degree of pyritization, which is the amount of pyrite that was able to be formed. So closer to 1 means that a lot of pyrite was close to the maximum amount that could be formed, so we were producing a lot of alkalinity. Lower than 1 means that there could be a lot more alkalinity being produced by these systems. But you can see mangroves are producing a lot of alkalinity through this process, especially compared to salt marshes and seagrass, but it is happening in all these ecosystems. Another cool thing that came out of this paper was that they looked at pyrite stocks in dead versus living mangroves and found that dead mangroves had lower amounts of pyritization, and they ascribed this to the transport of various things by living roots and how the living roots actually change the local pH conditions of the sediment here. So this could be another really important sort of process that's happening. So, really complicated, lots of processes, lots of ways to trap carbon, but what happens to the carbon cycle when we destroy or lose these blue carbon ecosystems? So I'm going to tell you a story about something that happened in 2015 and 2016 in northern Australia, in the Gulf of Carpentaria, so Darwin's up in here somewhere, but really there was a massive mangrove die-off, so this is before and after. Here's some dead mangrove trees. And 40 million mangrove trees died, over 2,000 kilometers of coastline, so more than 76 kilometers squared of mangrove forest were lost in this major die-off. Turns out what likely caused it was a local change in sea level that didn't allow the mangroves to get enough water. So sea level went down, and they basically didn't have enough water to support themselves, and they died off. So during this time period, there was actually, from the place where I did my PhD, actually, there were some scientists that went up there and were able to track how this affected the carbon cycle. So what happened during this die-off? And they looked at the carbon stocks in the living and then the dead mangroves, and this was like 8 months and then a year after. And what they found was that carbon stocks had been degraded from the living mangroves by about 30% over that time period. And they found lots of changes into the carbon cycle as well. So there was a lot of, there was a 270% increase in carbon emissions from the soils in the dead mangroves. Interestingly, there was a decrease in DIC, so carbon outwelling from these dead mangroves compared to the living ones. But it turns out a lot of this DIC was being outwelled as alkalinity, so actually storing carbon in a certain way. And so these big changes impacted the carbon cycle of these systems. So if we lose blue carbon ecosystems, we lose the carbon that's stored in their sediments. Another interesting thing that came out of this was that it turns out that methane is being emitted out of the dead mangrove and living mangrove trees. It's being released out of the trees themselves. So you can see the little chamber here that was connected to this methane CO2 analyzer. And they found that methane emissions from the dead mangroves were about 7 times higher than from the living mangrove. So there was a lot of methane that was coming from the tree roots, the dead tree roots, and coming up through the tree and out into the atmosphere. Once again, methane's a stronger greenhouse gas, sort of short-circuiting the carbon cycle. Okay, so let's take a look at blue carbon ecosystem. So you might look at these percentages, and maybe this is a hopeful thing you're thinking, that this is the amount of carbon per year based on emissions that these systems can store. I hate to tell you, this is not really very hopeful at all. It's in fact very depressing. This is the percentage per year that we are losing these ecosystems over the past century or so. So about 0.2 to 0.4% for mangroves, we've been losing them. It was actually a lot higher up until the 1980s, and we started to appreciate them a little more. 1.5% estimate loss of seagrass ecosystems, and 1 to 2% estimated per year loss of salt marshes. So remember, these ecosystems house about 2 years or so of emissions worth in their stock. So if we're losing these and the carbon's being re-emitted back into the atmosphere, this can be a large issue. Overall, about 50% of blue carbon ecosystems have been lost to date, so it's not very good. We haven't been very good stewards of these natural systems to protect them, even though they store so much carbon. This study estimated that protecting these ecosystems could avoid about 0.5 to 0.8% of yearly CO2 emissions, while restoration, which is restoring these ecosystems in areas where they've previously been lost, if we add that on top, we could avoid another 2.3 to 2.5% over time. But if you think about the amount of carbon that's already stored within these systems, this is really, this estimate here is really going off these loss estimates per year, so just kind of continuing down that track. But if something happens like a large die-off where we release a lot of carbon at once, we could be off there by a lot. So this really comes back to sort of the research that I want to do in my lab. So I run what I call the Coastal Carbon Laboratory, and I'm interested in, can we, use coastal blue carbon ecosystems to benefit marine carbon dioxide removal? And conversely, can MCDR actually benefit these ecosystems? So for instance, some of the projects I'm planning to do with some new PhD students is to look at marshes and in mesocosm experiments adding alkalinity to these Spartina marsh and trying to see how it potentially takes up more carbon dioxide, but also how it affects these keystone species that are really creating these habitats. I think the timer is. All right, I'm over. So with that being said, I will show you this beautiful picture of our planet, and maybe you can see some blue carbon systems there. But
Thank you. That was awesome. We have just a little bit of time before we transition into our next talk. So let's do maybe one question from the audience. And if you want to step up to one of these microphones here. Awesome.
Hi, Andrea Gratoli, Ohio State University. And you talk about restoring these sites, these ecosystems to bring up carbon sequestration to 2.3 or 2.8%, something like that. But is there a way to scale up and actually have increase the amount of seagrasses and mangroves beyond their natural extent to sort of farm CO2 sequestration?
You know, I mean, you probably could think of ways to innovate and do that, but in reality, a lot of these places where we've lost this habitat are now parking lots and other things that humans use. So restoration, you know, is not necessarily as scalable as one might think, and that's why really I really feel like we need to think about preserving the ones that are still there, because they have so much carbon buried within them. And you know, the thing is, I was thinking about the methane release from the trees and the fact that, you know, coral reefs actually make sort of carbon removal a little bit worse in the ocean. But that shouldn't be the reason that we're restoring these systems. I mean, they provide so much biodiversity, so much important things to humanity. We should really be restoring them for a lot of other reasons. And if they're providing carbon capture on top of that, it should be thought of as an additional benefit, I think.
Thank you so much. Let's hear it again. Thank you, Dr. Cyranak. Okay, so we're going to transition from blue carbon to blue foods, and I'm going to welcome my colleague Courtney McGeechee up to introduce our next speaker. Thank you.